That is a steel cable snapping with brutal force and whipping through the air at 80 miles per hour. And it happened so fast that you could miss it if you blinked. This is the infamous Xcelerator disaster at Knott's Berry Farm. Knott's Berry Farm wasn't always the thrill-seeker's paradise it is today. In fact, it started in the 1920s as something completely different, a small family-run berry farm in Buena Park, California. At first, it was just a roadside stand selling fresh boysenberries, jams, and homemade pies. But as the years passed, something unexpected happened. The farm became more than just a place to buy produce. It turned into an attraction. The Knott family added a small restaurant, a replica of a ghost town, and eventually roller coasters. What started as a simple berry farm had transformed into one of America's most beloved theme parks. And by the early 2000s, Knott's Berry Farm was competing with the best of them. It was no longer just a charming little slice of California history. It had evolved into a full-fledged amusement park with rides that could rival even Disneyland. They had their fair share of classics, but they wanted something new, something that would put them on the map as a serious contender in the thrill ride world. That's when they announced Xcelerator. It was going to be unlike anything the park had ever seen before. A high-speed, pulse-pounding roller coaster that would launch riders from a standstill to a breathtaking 82 miles per hour in just 2.3 seconds. That wasn't just fast, it was record-breaking at the time. The ride, designed by the well-known manufacturer Intamin, would send passengers rocketing up a 205-foot tower before immediately dropping them straight down at a 90-degree angle. The concept was simple, but brilliant. Most coasters relied on long chains or gravity to get their speed, but Xcelerator used a cutting-edge hydraulic launch system. The ride's mechanism worked kind of like a giant slingshot, using pressurized hydraulic fluid to shoot the train forward at an almost unbelievable speed. The moment the ride began, there was no slow climb up a hill, no chance to prepare. It was instant, heart-stopping acceleration that left riders breathless before they even realized what had happened. Knott's Berry Farm was confident they had a hit on their hands. And when Xcelerator finally opened in June of 2002, it did not disappoint. Thrill seekers flocked to the park, eager to experience the intense launch and near vertical drop. The ride quickly became one of the most popular attractions at Knott's, and for good reason. Everything about Xcelerator was designed to be fast. The ride itself lasted barely over a minute, but in that short time, it delivered an adrenaline rush that few other coasters could match. The theme of the ride only added to the excitement. The entire experience was styled after the 1950s hot rod culture. The station looked like an old-school drag strip. The trains were modelled after classic muscle cars, and even the ride's branding was inspired by the golden age of American automobiles. For years, Xcelerator ran without any major issues. Sure, like any roller coaster, it had its occasional breakdowns and maintenance checks, but nothing out of the ordinary. The park had strict safety protocols, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. But what people didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that deep inside the ride's mechanics, a disaster was waiting to happen. A flaw in the system that, if left unchecked, could turn a day of fun into something much more terrifying. And in 2009, that's exactly what happened. The day that changed everything. 12-year-old Kyle Wheeler was just like any other kid his age, curious, full of energy, and always looking for the next big adventure. Growing up in Weaverville, a quiet town in North Carolina, his world was far removed from the towering roller coasters and flashing lights of California's famous amusement parks. But on September 16th, 2009, Kyle's family decided to take a trip that would be nothing short of unforgettable. Kyle's parents, Russel and Anita Wheeler, weren't exactly thrill seekers, but they wanted to give their son an experience he would remember forever. A trip to Knott's Berry Farm seemed like the perfect way to do that. The park had everything, a mix of old-school charm, family-friendly attractions, and high-speed roller coasters that pushed the limits of adrenaline. It was a far cry from their usual routine, and they were all looking forward to a day filled with excitement. From the moment they arrived, Kyle must have been mesmerized. The towering coasters, the smell of funnel cakes drifting through the air, the distant sound of screams from riders plummeting down steep drops. It was no doubt everything he had imagined and more. The family spent the morning exploring the park, hopping from ride to ride, laughing and taking in the thrill of it all. But there was one ride that Kyle had been eyeing all day. None other than the Xcelerator. Even from a distance, it was impossible to ignore. The gleaming red and yellow track shot straight up into the sky, disappearing for a moment before plunging back down at an almost vertical angle. The roar of the hydraulic launch echoed through the park, followed by the gasps and cheers of those brave enough to take the ride. To Kyle, it looked like the ultimate experience. Fast, daring, and unlike anything he had ever been on before. His father, Russell, was hesitant at first. He wasn't the biggest fan of extreme rides, and the sheer speed of Xcelerator was enough to make anyone think twice. But Kyle was persistent, his excitement too contagious to ignore. After some convincing, Russell agreed. The two of them would ride Xcelerator together, while Anita watched from the sidelines. They made their way through the line, inching closer to the front as anticipation built. Every few minutes, another train would shoot off like a bullet, vanishing up the towering vertical track before rushing back down. Kyle could hardly stand still. He was ready. When it was finally their turn, they took their seats in the front row, the best view in the house. The ride operators moved quickly, securing their restraints and making sure everything was in place. Kyle's heart was racing, not from fear, but from sheer excitement. And then the countdown began. Everything that happened next would be burned into the Wheeler family's memory forever. The train launched forward with breathtaking speed, and the powerful hydraulic system sent it hurtling down the track in just a matter of seconds. But then, something went horribly wrong. Just 4 seconds into the launch, there was a sharp, deafening snap. A launch cable, which is one of the critical components responsible for propelling the train, suddenly snapped under the immense pressure. The force of it sent the thick steel cable whipping through the air at an unimaginable speed. Unfortunately, Kyle was right in its path. In an instant, metal debris flew toward him, the cable lashing out with the power of a bullwhip. The impact was immediate and devastating. The front of the train was torn apart, and Kyle was struck directly in the face, his body jolted backward by the sheer force of the blow. Russell, sitting right beside his son, barely had time to react. Panic surged through him as he turned to see Kyle, now bleeding, his face frozen in shock and pain. From the sidelines, Anita's world came crashing down. She had been watching the launch, expecting to see her husband and son disappear into the sky for the ride of their lives. Instead, she saw something out of a nightmare. The train, unable to complete its launch, lost momentum. Instead of soaring over the 205-foot peak, it rolled backward, coming to an abrupt stop. The ride operators, realizing something had gone terribly wrong, hit the emergency brakes. Russell was already yelling for help, his voice desperate, his hands gripping Kyle as if holding him together. His son was conscious but in agony, his body shaking from the trauma. Just like that, the once thrilling ride had turned into a scene of horror. Park employees rushed to the scene, emergency services were called, and within moments paramedics arrived. Kyle was carefully removed from the ride and rushed to the hospital. Notably, his injuries were severe. Another passenger on the train, a man seated further back, also reported injuries, though nothing compared to what Kyle had suffered. As Kyle was taken away, the reality of what had just happened set in. What was supposed to be the best day of his life had turned into something unthinkable. As for Knott's berry farm, the nightmare was only just beginning. The aftermath? The moment the ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens wailed into the distance, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in for the crowd. Kyle Wheeler was gone, rushed to the hospital with injuries so severe that no one could predict how things would turn out. But back at Knott's Berry Farm, the Xcelerator ride stood still and eerily silent, a very stark contrast to the deafening roar it had produced just minutes earlier. Once filled with laughter and excitement, the park now carried an unshakable tension. Something had gone terribly wrong. And the worst part, no one saw it coming. Russel and Anita Wheeler, still in a state of shock, scrambled to the hospital as quickly as they could. The car ride was still a blur, with flashes of fear, silent prayers, and desperate attempts to make sense of what had just happened. A theme park ride wasn't supposed to end like this. It was supposed to be fun, thrilling, something to look back on with excitement. But now all they could think about was whether Kyle would even make it through the night. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors and nurses moved with urgency. Kyle had suffered deep lacerations across his face and body, his knee and ankle severely damaged from the force of the impact. Blood loss was a major concern, and immediate surgery was necessary. Every second counted. As his parents arrived, they were met with a sight no mother or father should ever have to see. Their son barely conscious, hooked up to machines, fighting through pain no child should endure. The hours dragged on. Surgery after surgery, skin grafts, repairs to torn muscle and tissue. The medical team did everything they could to stabilize Kyle, but the road ahead was daunting. He would need months, maybe even years of recovery. And even then, there were no guarantees. But while Kyle fought to heal, a storm was brewing outside the hospital walls. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Local reports turned into national headlines. People wanted answers. How could something like this happen? Knott's Berry Farm had a reputation for safety. Xcelerator was one of its most popular rides, thrilling visitors for years without any known major accidents. So why on that September afternoon did a launch cable suddenly snap with enough force to nearly kill a child? Investigators wasted no time. The California Division of Occupational Safety and Health, along with other industry experts, descended upon the park, determined to uncover the truth. The ride was immediately shut down, cordoned off from guests and thoroughly inspected. Every inch of track, every mechanical part, every last detail was scrutinized. If there was a flaw, they were going to find it. And what they found was disturbing. The cable that had snapped, sending shards of metal and debris flying at deadly speeds, was not just an unfortunate accident. It was a failure that could have been prevented. Xcelerator's launch system relied on a high-tension steel cable to propel the train forward. This cable endured extreme stress with every launch, stretching and retracting at incredible speeds. Over time, wear and tear were expected, which is why regular inspections were critical. The manufacturer, Intamin, had guidelines for this kind of maintenance, specifying how often the cables needed to be checked and replaced. But here's where things went wrong. Knott's Berry Farm believed that inspections were required every 6 months, but investigators discovered that the real guideline called for monthly checks. That meant the ride had gone far too long without the necessary maintenance, allowing the cable to deteriorate to a dangerously fragile state. And if that wasn't bad enough, by the time Kyle and his father had stepped onto the ride, the park was already 19 days past its last scheduled inspection. 19 days. A gap that, had it been addressed, could have saved Kyle from a nightmare that would haunt him forever. As these findings surfaced, the public outrage grew. People demanded accountability. How could a park as established as Knott's allow something like this to happen? Was this negligence? A simple miscommunication? Or worse, an attempt to cut corners to keep the ride running without delay? The Wheelers, still reeling from the trauma, now had a battle ahead of them that went far beyond Kyle's recovery. The hospital bills alone were staggering, $60,000 and climbing. And that wasn't even factoring in the emotional and psychological toll this had taken on their family. Legal action became inevitable. They had to fight, not just for their son, but to make sure something like this never happened to another child again. As the investigation continued, more unsettling details emerged. Xcelerator wasn't the only ride with a history of cable failures. In 2004, a nearly identical incident occurred at Cedar Point in Ohio on the Top Thrill dragster, another Intamin coaster that used the same hydraulic launch system. In that case, a launch cable snapped and injured 4 people. The similarities were impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a freak accident, it was a pattern, and it raised a chilling question. Had the warning signs been there all along, For months, Xcelerator remained closed. Knott's Berry Farm, under immense pressure, vowed to overhaul its maintenance protocols, ensuring stricter inspections and better communication with ride manufacturers. The state agency, overseeing the investigation, mandated additional safeguards, making it clear that such negligence would not be tolerated in the future. Eventually, a settlement was reached between the Wheelers and the park. The exact terms were never disclosed, but one thing was clear: Kyle's medical expenses would be covered, and the family would receive compensation for their suffering. But no amount of money could undo what had happened. The trauma, the pain, the months spent in hospital rooms, watching Kyle struggle to regain movement in his knee and ankle, the countless nightmares, the lingering fear that something so simple like a day at a theme park could turn into a near-death experience. And yet through it all, Kyle fought. He endured the surgeries, the physical therapy, the setbacks, and the frustrations. Slowly but surely, he began to heal. The scars remained, both physical and emotional, but he refused to let that day define the rest of his life. By 2010, Xcelerator reopened, now with reinforced cables and a stricter maintenance routine. The ride that had once been a symbol of cutting-edge speed and innovation was now a reminder of what could go wrong when safety takes a backseat to operation schedules. To this day, thrill seekers continue to ride Xcelerator, feeling the rush of acceleration and the stomach-dropping descent. But few know the story of Kyle Wheeler. Few realise that one day, a ride designed for excitement became the setting of a horror no family should ever have to endure. The Wheelers never returned to Knott's Berry Farm. The memories were too painful. But their story serves as a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder that even the most thrilling attractions can hide unseen dangers, and that behind every safety protocol, every maintenance checklist, there are real lives at stake. Because at the end of the day, a roller coaster is just a machine, and machines can fail. But when they do, it's not just bolts and gears at risk, it's the people who trust them with their lives.